Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to the Steinberg Halion 7 tutorial series. Today we're going to take our first look at wavetable synthesis. It's a pretty huge subject, there's no way I can possibly cover it in one episode, but by the end of today's video we're going to generate what I hope you'll agree is a very nice sounding synthesizer from something that started out life as a completely different sound. Wavetable synthesis is just an absolutely fascinating subject. Hope you enjoy it too. If you're enjoying this series and you'd like to help support my channel, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. It's an awesome way to do it. So as you can see, I've initialized a wavetable synth, one of the init programs. There it is. And straight out of the box, you get a sine wave. Now that sine wave is not being generated by an oscillator. This is not an analog synthesizer. It's a completely different synthesis engine. When you look at the zone, you're fooled into thinking that it actually is a sine wave. But to see what's really going on, we click the Wavetable tab. Very uninspiring though it currently is, this is our Wavetable tab. At the bottom of the window, we have our wavetable. At the moment, there's only a single entry in it. Entries in the wavetable in Halion are called segments. This is our first segment. Think of this sine wave as a preset. It's basically some configuration data stored somewhere in the system. It's not an audio file, and the sine wave isn't being generated from first design principles either. It's a preset. We can change the preset very easily. I'll throw away the sine wave and instead let's add a pulse wave. And that sounds like a pulse wave. But it's only when we start adding multiple entries into a wavetable that it's possible to really understand what's going on. So I'm going to add a few extra ones in. I'll put a sine back in, and let's have a triangle and a saw. Let's have some noise as well, some pink noise. So now our wavetable has 5 entries. I'm going to zoom out so that we can see in the envelope viewer, which is this view up above. This is a graphical representation of the crossfades between these 5 wavetable entries. Each time I click on one of the segments, you can see an orange line. That's representing the center point of any single wave. So this orange line here is the center point of the sawtooth wave. At that moment in time, as this sound is played, you'll be hearing this in its entirety and nothing else. At all other times, we're either crossfading from the previous wave into the new one or out of the current one into the next one. Before I say anything else, let's just listen to the 5 waves get played sequentially. So we went from pulse into sine, into triangle, into saw, and at the end we played a noise segment. Now it didn't sound like noise. By the time I got to the end, once a wavetable's finished, the player will basically stick on the last wave, whatever that happens to be. Now I added pink noise into this table, so you might have been expecting to hear noise. That's not how wavetables work at all. Just a quick note about it sticking on this last node. This option here, hold last spectrum, is what's doing that. If I disengage that, the sound would simply stop once we get to the end of the table. Now the reason why you're hearing a pitched tone rather than pink noise when this thing settles out in its sustain phase is because these waves are played many times. This entire playback takes 4 seconds to get to the point where 4 waves have been played. Basically each wave is being played for a second, constantly crossfading from one into the next. And by the time we get to the orange line at the end, which is 4 seconds of time, we then stick on the pink noise, and from that point onwards, the only thing that you can hear is the pink noise wave. Let's listen to it one more time. Okay, I'm going to turn the volume very low. In fact, I'll just turn it off. You can see it in the oscilloscope. What you're seeing in the oscilloscope is a perfect representation of what's in the wave. I'll just freeze it so that we can see the two. This is that. Absolutely in its entirety. It's a perfect representation of that wave. But here's the rub. It's playing, what pitch was I playing at then? 261 times a second. I'm playing middle C. So this wave is being played 261 times a second. It doesn't matter that the wave itself is comprised of essentially random amplitudes. Noise is simply random sound. The fact that it's being played 261 times a second is being turned into pitched sound. That's how pitched sound works. If you oscillate basically any sound other than a flat line, which isn't sound at all, any sound repeated consistently at a specific frequency will generate a tone of that frequency. That's simply the laws of physics. So here we have this noise wave being played 261 times a second, and we hear it as pitched sound. That, in a nutshell, is wavetable synthesis. We play each one of these waves however many times the key on our keyboard dictates. We have a pitched keyboard transmitting pitch information into Halion. It says, okay, you want me to play these entries 261 times a second. I will do that. The amount of time that it spends playing each one of those waves is determined by our envelope. This viewer is critical to determining the playback. So all of these triangles are basically representing the crossfades. We can pick them up. You can see the mouse changing shape, and we can change the shape of the crossfade. This, by the way, is pretty much the only way to ever get any individual wave to play consistently for any period of time. By default, the natural nature of a wavetable is to be constantly morphing, constantly in motion, so you never actually hear exactly the same wave in any two consecutive moments. The entire thing is constantly morphing, and by changing our crossfade waves is one way to subvert that. If you've been messing with these crossfade waves and you want to change them back into simple linear crossfade waves, you can simply press the Control key and then click the wave, and it basically flatlines it again. We can change the length of time the player spends playing each wave as well. Let's say we want to play the pulse wave for 2 seconds. I can pick up this orange line. You can see the time marker along the bottom. These numbers represent seconds, so I can put that to 2 seconds. If we zoom out so that we can see the entire thing again, now it's going to spend 2 seconds playing the pulse wave, still spending the entire time, not just the last second, the entire time morphing towards the second wave, which is sine, and then 1 second each for the rest of the waves. If I want to adjust the length of time between any two segments, but leave everything else completely untouched, I can enter fixed mode, click the little F button, and now when I drag this window, you can see that everything to the right is stuck. If I take this line past the current marker, you can see the wave in the viewer down below actually changing position in the wavetables. Come back out of fixed mode. Then we have another couple of very important options in this toolbar as well. Let's have a look at legato first. So at the moment, legato is off. I'll explain what it means when I come to turn it on. I'm going to play an arpeggiated chord. Each note I play restarts playback of the entire wavetable. There's only ever one playhead in a wavetable. It doesn't matter how many notes you have pressed down, the marker of the wavetable will determine all of the voices to do that thing and exactly that thing. But as you saw, each time when I press one of those arpeggiated notes, holding the others down, the wavetable jumped back to the beginning. If I engage legato, however, it won't. Dramatically different effect, really important button to understand, and also to understand that there's a single playhead for wavetables. Each note does not have its own scan through the wavetable. That's not how it works. Then we have loop mode. What happens when we get to the end? At the moment, when we get to the end of the wavetable, it simply sticks on the last wave and plays that until we let the key go. If we engage looping, however, I'll turn it down a bit violent. When it gets to the end, it'll simply loop around and start again, and we've got alternating, which means when it gets to the end it'll bounce back on itself. Then we have playback speed. At the moment the speed is set to 100, which is basically the default. When you add a new wavetable to the synthesis, all other things being equal, Halion will spend 1 second playing each segment, but we can vary that. If I speed the playback up to 292, why not? It'll play much faster. So it took maybe 1.5 seconds to get to the end then. And of course we can slow it down as well. In addition to being able to pick up this speed marker, which is basically the way I do it more often than not, you can click in here and type a manual number, or you can click the 2x and half buttons as well. And then it'll use the scale as printed, but basically double the envelope time every time you click this button. And you can see the total cumulative output of any individual time spent playing these segments. I just had to go into investigation mode to figure out why this didn't say 1 second, and then I remembered that I'd moved all the windows around. Oh dear. Down in the segment viewer at the bottom of the interface, We can right-click delete. We can right-click select all and then perform operations on all of the segments simultaneously. For instance, delete them all. In fact, I'm going to do it. Let's throw everything away. Sines and sawtooths are all very well and good for demonstration purposes, but we want to get this wavetable working a bit harder. Let's throw all of that away. And this time, I'm going to load a sample from the media bay. Now, up until now, the sample viewer at the top of the wavetable editor has had nothing whatsoever to do because none of the sounds that we were playing with were samples. They were wavetable entries from Halion's own catalogue. But if we open the media bay, I've selected this sound, beautifully titled FCO1GF MFX SOR, oh yes. And let's drop it into the sample editor. And it sounds like this. I'll play it directly from within the sample editor so that you can hear the raw sample itself. Now there's a nice trick if you load a tuned sample into the sample editor. There's a button at the top of the window that says Show Pitch Detection Curve. I can now hover over this red line and it will tell me what pitch it thinks this sound is, and it's obviously vacillating between G and G sharp. Let's presume it's a G, and I'll play a G2 on my keyboard. Doesn't sound much like the sample, does it? What's happened there is that the entire sample has been loaded into memory. That's absolutely fine. But when I press a key on the keyboard, we have a single entry in our wavetable representing the very beginning of the entire sample. So the sample takes, 0.9, best part of a second to play the entire thing, and more than half of it's silence. All we're hearing is the very, very beginning of the sample, and it bears no relation whatsoever to the sound we actually want to hear. It's such an unpleasant sound, actually. My tuner is struggling to actually identify any pitched tone in that. What we need to do is fill our wavetable with far more entries, far more representative entries of the sample as it's played back over time. At the moment, we have a single wave in our table, but we can change that. This number of waves box at the top of the sample editor, I'm going to add 50 entries instead. Now, all of these blue markers in the sample editor are indicating single moments in time when a snapshot of the overall sound has been taken. Let's play the G2 again and see what it sounds like now. Not bad. There's the original. So by taking more snapshots of this sound, we're approaching something like what a sampler would do, taking lots of snapshots of the sound and then sticking them all together. The wavetable is doing something slightly unusual. It's taking 50 fairly small representations of the sound and then crossfading between them, and it's giving us a reasonable representation of the overall effect. If I select one of these earlier segments, when the sound's pretty loud and still fairly active, I'm going to zoom in. Now, depending on the quality of your monitor, because it's incredibly faint, you can just about see the orange bands that represent the snapshot of time that this sample is occupying. I actually have backlights and it's incredibly difficult for me to see. I think it's about there, but I can't exactly say for sure. But what you're actually seeing is windows of time. What I can do actually is I'll select one of these waves that has much less activity in it. And now I can tell there's the two humps of the sample that have been photographed. And there they are. Now, can you also see they don't look absolutely identical? In the main sample, they're more or less perfectly aligned. This is a stereo wave. But in the viewer below, they've been kind of offset in a strange sort of way. That's because the wavetable has aligned the phase of the two waves. Got a stereo wave here. The wavetable is basically trying to figure out the best possible way it can to jump forwards these arbitrary periods of time and to stick all of the waves together. And you can see that the phases are actually, one wave terminates pretty much where the next wave carries over. Now we can disable that feature. Here it is. It's called align phases. If I say keep original phase instead, got the same kind of synchronicity between the two waves. However, it won't sound quite as good. Now you can hear stuttering as I play the notes. That's because the phases are no longer aligned. These arbitrary snapshots of time that are separated by quite big distances in sample terms. You know, we're taking tiny snapshots of waves here, and this marker over here is physically unrelated to the succeeding one. And so we hear it stutter as those phases are out of alignment. Realign the phase. Basically just shifts that wave forwards or backwards a little bit to make sure that everything works smoothly. Really dramatic improvement. You can go even further than that actually. There's a function called interpolate phases, which effectively crossfades between the waves inside the algorithm. I'm not talking about wavetable crossfading here. There's a CPU burden on interpolation of phase. Generally speaking, I don't turn it on. I don't find that I need it very often, but if you want that extra little boost in quality, it can sometimes help. Now then, it's all very well and good playing the pitched note of the sample as it was originally loaded in, but what happens if I play a note 1 octave higher? Now ultimately my goal is to make some sort of kind of synthesizer ready sound out of this, and it's just a little bit too short, so let's slow it down. I'll halve the speed, so now it's going to take twice as long to scan through the wavetable. The next problem that I have, if I want to make a synthesizer sound out of this, is that it's fading away a little bit too quickly. If we have a look at the whole sample again, it's active for basically 1/4 of a second, which we've just doubled. So we bought ourselves half a second, but then I jumped up an octave, knocking myself back down to 1/4 of a second again. And all of that stuff that we're hearing at the end is this very long period of almost silence. So we've got a couple of normalization options available to us at this point. You can turn normalization mode on from either the button, the N button, or from the drop down to the right of it. Firstly, we can normalize by sequence, which basically keeps it's going to maximize the volume as much as it can, but it won't break the internal consistency of the waves themselves. So as we scan through the table, you'll see by the time we get to the end, they're still very quiet. You're basically normalizing to the point of the loudest segment of any of the 50. It's going to help a little bit. It's made it slightly louder, but if you want to go a little bit more extreme than that, you can normalize each individual wave. And now again, scroll to the right, every wave has been normalized. This is going to quite radically change the sound because we're really fundamentally messing with the internal relationships of all of these segments now. But if the mission is to get to some sort of usable synthesizer sound, then again, this is another good step in the right direction. What's the next thing that we can do to improve the sound? I want to try and pull away some of that high-end fizz. The very, very high frequency kind of shimmer to every note. I just want to control that a little bit. Well, the wavetable has its own filter. Now to engage the filter, we need to jump back to the zone. The zone basically controls master information about the sound. And here's our filter. Let's turn it on. Back to the wavetable. You do have an edited highlights set of features in the zone. There's some of the functionality there. But the wavetable contains all of that plus more. This is where we actually define a filter for the wavetable. Now I want to apply a filter to every single one of these 50 entries in the wavetable. That's very easy to do. I can right click, select all. Now I can start adding filter nodes to this filter window. It's not immediately obvious how to do it. Double click and it suddenly starts becoming much more obvious what we're doing. So let's add some nodes in. So there's a few things I want to do to this sound. Just flatten these out. So this is essentially our unfiltered sound. Very slightly edited. First thing that I want to do is get rid of a little bit of that honk. Around about 350 to 450. Turn the filter off with the little off button here. But the real reason I'm here is to get rid of that high-end fizz. So let's add a high cut and play with this until we like the sound. Don't want to take it all away, I just want to tame that sharpness. Excellent. And now where we've got our primary sound, let's see if any part of it will benefit from being boosted. That's not bad. Now, that filter's been applied to every one of these 50 segments, but it does bear saying every single segment has its own filter. If you really want to go that far, knock yourself out, but I'm happy to basically operate on the entire wave. Before we go any further, I'm going to do a non-wavetable based thing. I'm just going to add some release to the sound. That was easy. So now that we've built our basic sound, let's head back up to the Zone tab and see what the Wavetable oscillation section has to offer. Well, we have a second kind of filter. It's called Formant. It's above the primary filter. Let's engage Formant. Now, the most common use case for discussing Formant is in the relation to human vowel sounds. Every human vowel, every kind of sound that we make, in fact, the thing that defines a vowel from a consonant is the fact that it has fixed formants. It has these breathy frequencies at particular points on the frequency curve that's pretty much consistent for all human beings. It's one of the reasons why we're able to so effectively communicate with each other, even when we don't speak the same language, because we all understand these formant sounds. So that's certainly the most common use of the term. But actually, a formant is just an accentuation of frequency in any domain. A trumpet has a formant, a saxophone has a formant, specific frequencies that kind of poke out and make that instrument sound the way it does. Well, we can introduce formants into our wavetables as well. So if you're trying to replicate a real-world sound, you might want to use the formant options to kind of push forwards the frequencies that sound like a trumpet. So now that we've turned it on, if you're watching the spectrum analyzer down below, you can quite clearly see what's being done. Arbitrary frequency ranges are just being boosted. Once we've identified the particular formant frequencies that we want to either accentuate or de-accentuate, you can actually pull them down with the formant control as well. We have scale, which basically determines how much of it's going to happen. And we can also introduce key follow if we want the formant to track with the keyboard, which is kind of counterintuitive, because generally speaking, you want formants to stick pretty much where they are, but you can have the key follow the formant up the keyboard. So many 80s sounds are jumping into my head. Let's turn Formant back off. But the real icing on the cake, in my opinion, is multi-oscillator mode. If we turn on this incredibly innocuous little button that just says multi, we now have the ability to generate multiple voices of the same wavetable. So let's have 5. And we're going to detune them all very slightly against each other. I'm using the graph to make sure that I don't go too far. Tiny bit of detune. Tiny little bit of spread, which is basically moving the waves forwards and backwards relative to each other. And this completely transforms the sound. Been really into my Blade Runner soundtrack recently. And we started from... I think that's a good place to stop. Lots more to investigate with the wavetable. We'll do that next time. Thanks very much for watching. Hit like if you enjoyed it. I'll see you then.